In 2010, a scientist named Peter Turchin published a short forecast in the journal Nature, one of the most respected publications on Earth. He wrote that the years around 2020 would bring a wave of political breakdown across the United States and Western Europe. He named the drivers: stagnant wages, a widening gulf between the rich and everyone else, a glut of educated people with nowhere left to rise, exploding public debt. It was printed, it was dated, it sat in the archive with a volume number and a page number, and then the decade he described arrived and did almost exactly what he said it would. And still, almost nobody has told you that the instability you have been living through was called in print 10 years early, by a man applying a pattern that was first written down in 1916 by an embittered Italian who spent his final years alone in a villa with 18 cats, watching a machine he could see clearly and could not stop. Because there is a machine underneath all of it. The people who rule a society come in two types, and the type in power at any given moment is a clock. And the clock tells you what kind of catastrophe is coming next. It has run in Rome. It has run in revolutionary France. It ran through a superpower that dissolved on live television, while almost no one named what they were watching. And the part that should disturb you is not that the clock can be read, it is who the clock reaches for when it finally runs out. So get comfortable and subscribe or join if you have not, because there is a version of this on Patreon where these same threads, power and collapse, and deep history and the physics of how whole systems fail, run wider and darker than the channel itself can go. Stay to the end, because by the time we get there, you are going to understand exactly why the people best equipped to see this coming are the ones it comes for first. Let's begin. There is a number hidden inside every ruling class, and when that number drifts past a certain point, the people at the top of the society begin to die. Not in the abstract, not in the sense that empires fade and statues crumble. I mean the specific men and women who hold the power, the ones who run the banks and write the laws and shape what everyone else is allowed to think. Start losing their heads, sometimes literally. They get dragged out of their houses, they get shot in cellars, they flee across borders in the middle of the night with whatever they can sew into the lining of a coat, and the part that should genuinely unsettle you, the part that has been sitting inside a 4-volume book published in 1916 and that almost nobody in a position of authority wants to say out loud, is that this number can be tracked. It behaves. It moves in one direction for a while, and then it moves in the other. And the swing between those two directions is not random, and it is not driven by the things you were told drive history. And right now, in your country, whichever country that is, the number is sitting exactly where it always sits in the years before the killing starts. The man who found this pattern spent the last decade of his life almost completely alone, in a villa above Lake Geneva, surrounded by cats, reportedly 18 of them, Angora cats, the long-haired kind, moving through the rooms of a house he had named after the breed. He had been one of the most celebrated economists in Europe. He had held the most prestigious chair in the field. And he had walked away from all of it because he had become convinced that economics and mathematics and reason itself could not explain the single most important fact about human beings, which is that we are not reasonable, and that we almost never do things for the reasons we say we do. So he sat in that villa, bitter, half forgotten, watching a continent he had once believed in tear itself apart in a world war he considered proof of everything he had come to think, and he wrote down the machine. The actual mechanism, the 2-stroke engine that he believed had been running underneath every civilization that has ever existed, grinding elites into power and then grinding them back out again, on a cycle so reliable that if you understood it, you could look at any society at any moment and tell roughly where it was in the turn, and roughly what kind of catastrophe was coming next. His name was Vilfredo Pareto, and I want to be careful here, because you may already know that name, and if you do, you almost certainly know it for the wrong reason. You know it as the 80-20 rule. 80% of your results come from 20% of your effort. 20% of the people own 80% of the wealth. That is his. He noticed it first, in the distribution of land in Italy, and it made him modestly famous in a way that has since been flattened into a productivity slogan printed on the walls of open plan offices. But that is a rounding error next to what he actually spent his final years building, and the fact that the world remembers the office poster and forgot the machine is itself part of the story I am going to tell you. Because the machine is not comfortable. The machine says that everything you believe about progress, about democracy, about the direction your society is heading, is a story the current rulers tell to justify the fact that they are the current rulers. And the machine says that story has an expiration date, and that you can read the date, and that reading the date does not help you at all. That last part is the one that took me a while to sit with. The people who can see the pattern most clearly are, by the logic of the pattern itself, the ones it is about to destroy. Hold on to that. It is going to come back, and when it does, it is going to be about you. So let me tell you how the engine works, because once you see the two moving parts, you will not be able to stop seeing them, and I mean that as both a promise and a warning. Pareto argued that every society, without a single exception in recorded history, is run by a small minority, not most of the people, not the will of the population, a small governing elite, sitting on top of a much larger mass that is governed. This is not a controversial claim once you actually look at it, and we will come back to how airtight it is, but hold it for now as the floor everything else stands on. There is always an elite. The only real question, the question that turns out to determine the fate of the entire society, is what kind of people that elite is made of. And Pareto said that ruling classes come in two fundamental psychological types, and that he was borrowing the names for those types from a Florentine who had been dead for 400 years. The names are lions and foxes. If those two animals ring a bell, it is because Niccolo Machiavelli used them first, in a short and famously cold-blooded book called The Prince, written around 1513. In the 18th chapter, Machiavelli tells the aspiring ruler that he has to be two beasts at once. He has to be a lion, because the lion frightens off the wolves, but the lion is stupid and walks into traps. So he also has to be a fox, because the fox sees the trap. Machiavelli meant this as advice to a single prince, a tactical note about how to survive in power. Be brave, but not naive. Be clever, but not cowardly. It was one line of guidance in a manual for staying alive at the top of Renaissance Italy. Pareto took that image and did something much larger and much darker with it. He said the two animals are not two skills that one wise ruler should combine. They are two different kinds of human being, and they compete, and over time one kind tends to crowd out the other at the top of the society, and which kind is winning tells you where you are in the cycle. The foxes are the people driven by what he called the instinct for combinations. These are the schemers, the innovators, the deal makers, the manipulators. They are clever, they are flexible, they love novelty, they love a complicated arrangement, they would always rather negotiate than fight. In economic life they are the speculators, the financiers, the people who make money, move and multiply through cunning rather than through production. In political life they govern through persuasion, through management, through the manipulation of opinion, through clever compromise. They are, in a word, the smart ones. And Pareto is not using smart as a compliment, he is using it as a diagnosis. The lions are the other kind. They are driven by what he called the persistence of aggregates, which is a heavy phrase for something simple. It means loyalty. Attachment, the willingness to hold a group together and to fight and die for it. Lions believe in things. They are patriotic, they are religious, they are traditional, they value family and honour and the nation and the tribe, and above all they are willing to use force. Where the fox sees a problem and reaches for a scheme, the lion sees a problem and reaches for a sword. In economic life, the lions are the savers, the builders, the people who want to own solid things and pass them down. In political life, they rule by conviction, and when conviction is not enough, by violence, which they are entirely comfortable using because they believe in the thing they are using it for. Pareto worked this out with a precision that goes far beyond a folk contrast between clever people and brave people, and I want to give you the economic version of it, because it is where his engineer's mind shows through, and because it makes the whole thing feel less like a metaphor and more like a set of forces. He divided the economically active part of any society into two groups. He called them, roughly, the speculators and the rentiers, and if you have ever wondered why a society can look rich and dynamic and doomed all at the same time, this is the answer. The speculators are the fox economy. They are the people whose income comes from ingenuity, from novel schemes, from putting deals together, from the clever recombination of resources and the manipulation of financial instruments, from getting in early and out clean. They love change, because change is where the opportunities hide. The rentiers are the lion economy. They are the people who live on fixed, steady, cautious returns, the savers, the small proprietors, the people who own a solid thing and want it to keep being solid, who fear change because change is where their security goes to die. And Pareto made a claim about the balance between these two that lands like a diagnosis of the modern world. A society in which the rentiers, the cautious lion savers, almost completely dominate, he said, becomes stationary and crystallized, stiff, unable to adapt, eventually stagnant. But a society in which the speculators, the fox schemers, come to predominate, lacks all stability, lives in a permanent state of shaky equilibrium, and is perpetually one shock away from coming apart. He was describing, 100 years early, the exact pathology of a financialized economy, an economy that has tipped so far toward the money movers and away from the builders that it looks brilliant and dynamic right up until the moment it discovers it is standing on nothing. And he drew one more distinction inside the concept of force itself. A distinction so sharp that it cuts most modern political commentary to ribbons, and it matters for where we are going. Pareto insisted that force and violence are not the same thing, and that confusing them is a symptom of a decaying elite. A strong elite, he said, uses force cleanly, decisively, and rarely, precisely because everyone knows it will. A weak and frightened elite either collapses into using no force at all, or it thrashes around in spasms of ugly, ineffective violence that only advertise its weakness. He put it in a line I keep returning to. Trajan, the great Roman emperor, was strong, he said, not violent. Caligula, the mad one, was violent, not strong. The healthy use of force looks like calm and rarely needs to be shown. The unhealthy substitute for it looks like flailing cruelty on the way down. And a fox elite in its final phase, having lost the capacity for clean force and retaining only the capacity for squeamishness punctuated by panic, tends to produce exactly the second thing, which fools no one and holds back nothing. Now here is the first turn of the engine, and this is where it stops being a personality quiz and starts being a clock. A society that has just come through a period of chaos, a civil war, a conquest, a revolution, tends to be run by lions. That makes sense. To grab power in a violent world, you have to be willing to be violent, and to hold a shattered society together, you need conviction and cohesion, and the readiness to crush anyone who threatens the order. Lions found regimes. But lions are not good at running a peaceful, prosperous, complicated society over the long term. Complexity rewards cunning. Trade rewards cleverness. As the society gets richer and more stable, the foxes start to rise, because in a settled world the fox skills, the deals and the schemes and the clever management, are simply more useful and more profitable than raw force. The lions have heirs who discover that it is much more pleasant to make money through financial arrangements than to risk your life defending a border. Slowly, generation by generation, the foxes accumulate at the top, and the society that they build is genuinely impressive. It is wealthy, it is sophisticated, it is tolerant, it is clever. It is also, Pareto says, quietly killing itself, and it cannot feel the wound. Because here is what the foxes cannot do. They cannot use force, and worse. They lose the ability to even understand force as a real thing. A ruling class that governs entirely through persuasion and manipulation slowly forgets that persuasion has a flaw, and the flaw is violence, and that the whole clever superstructure of law and finance and public opinion rests on somebody, somewhere, being willing to pick up a weapon on the regime's behalf. The foxes grow squeamish. They start to see the use of force as barbaric, as beneath them, as something only stupid people resort to. They become, in Pareto's account, humanitarian, which he does not entirely mean as praise. They talk more and more about sensibility and feeling and reform, and they become less and less capable of doing the one thing a ruling class must ultimately be able to do, which is defend itself. And while they are up there getting cleverer and softer, something is happening down below. The forceful people, the natural lions, the ones with conviction and cohesion and the willingness to fight, are being born into the lower classes just as often as ever. But the fox elite will not let them in. A closed, clever, frightened aristocracy stops recruiting the dangerous men from below, so the lions pile up at the bottom of the society, capable, angry, excluded, and increasingly organized, while the foxes sit at the top, wealthy, refined, and defenseless. And then, Pareto says, the lion reaches the fox with a single well-aimed blow, and the argument is over. He actually wrote something close to that, buried in a footnote in the treatise, and the image is worth having in his own terms. The fox, he wrote, may by his cunning escape for a certain length of time, but the day may come when the lion will reach him with a well-aimed cuff, and that will be the end of the argument. There is a whole theory of history compressed into that one sentence. All the schemes, all the deals, all the clever management, all the persuasion and the manipulation and the endless talking, and it works. It genuinely works for years, for decades, sometimes for generations. The fox really does escape, over and over, for a certain length of time. And then one day the length of time runs out, and the argument, which the foxes thought was a permanent conversation they were winning, turns out to have been a countdown the whole time, and it ends not with a better argument, but with a blow. I need to stop here for a second, because I want you to feel how strange it is that a man wrote this down as a general law more than 100 years ago, sitting in a villa full of cats, and I want you to notice that he was not describing the past. He thought he was describing a mechanism that was still running, that would keep running, that was running through his own moment and would run through ours. He called the book, in Italian, the Trattato di Sociologia Generale, the General Treatise on Sociology. When it was finally translated into English in 1935, 12 years after he died, they gave it a colder and stranger title, The Mind and Society, 4 volumes, around 2,000 pages. Almost nobody reads it now. It is dense, it is repetitive, it is full of a private numbering system where every paragraph has its own number, and Pareto uses those numbers to cross-reference himself thousands of times, so reading it feels like crawling through the inside of a machine that is aware of its own gears. And buried in that machine, at paragraph 2053, is the line that everything else in this story orbits around. History, he wrote, is a graveyard of aristocracies. Sit with the confidence of that. Not history contains the graves of some aristocracies, not some ruling classes eventually decline. History is a graveyard. The natural, final, guaranteed condition of a ruling class is death, and the only variation is the manner and the timing. And the reason it happens, the reason it always happens, is the exact mechanism I just walked you through. The foxes take over, they hollow out the capacity for force, the lions accumulate below, and the graveyard takes another tenant. But this is where I have to slow you down, because if you are like most intelligent people who first encounter this idea, your brain has already tried to make it comfortable, and I want to catch that move before it settles. When you hear the phrase circulation of elites, the modern mind reaches for something hopeful. Circulation, you think, means mobility. It means the talented poor kid rises to the top on merit. It means the old money makes way for the new. It means the system refreshes itself and gives everyone a shot. That is not what Pareto meant. That comforting reading is exactly the kind of story a fox elite tells about itself, and Pareto would have found your instinct to reach for it darkly funny. The circulation of elites does not mean the masses rise. It means one elite replaces another elite. It means the people at the bottom stay at the bottom, while the identity of the people at the top changes, sometimes gradually through recruitment, sometimes catastrophically through revolution. When the French Revolution devoured the old aristocracy, the peasants of France did not become the rulers of France. A new elite took over. When the Russian Revolution destroyed the Tsar and his court, the Russian worker did not come to power. A new elite, wearing the language of the worker, took over, and it was every bit as much of a ruling minority as the one it replaced. The gap between the rulers and the ruled does not close. It cannot close. That is the whole point. All that ever changes is who is standing in the small circle at the top and what kind of animal they are. The masses are not the players in this game. The masses are the board. And if that lands as bleak, I have worse news, and this is the second thing your mind will try to escape into, so let me close that exit too. You are probably thinking that this might have been true for Rome, or for the kings of old Europe, but that we have invented something that breaks the cycle. We invented democracy. We vote. We can throw the rulers out peacefully every few years, so surely the whole grim machine of foxes and lions and graveyards does not apply to us. I understand why you want that to be true. It is the founding comfort of the entire modern world. But the people who studied this most carefully concluded, with a kind of cold precision, that democracy does not escape the cycle at all. It just hides it better. And the man who proved it, or came as close to proving it as this kind of thing can be proved, was a young German named Robert Michels, and his story is the next turn of the screw, because he went looking for the exception and instead found the iron law. Before I get to Michels, though, I owe you the man in the villa, because you cannot understand why Pareto saw the world this way without understanding what the world did to him, and because his own life is the first and cruelest example of the pattern he discovered. The personal and the theoretical here are not two separate threads. They are the same wire, running in both directions. Vilfredo Pareto was born in Paris on the 15th of July, 1848, which is a date worth pausing on, because 1848 was the year Europe caught fire. Revolutions broke out across the continent. From France to Italy to the German states to the Austrian Empire, a wave of liberal and nationalist uprisings that felt, to the people living through them, like the birth of a new and freer world. Pareto was literally born into that hope. His father was an Italian marquis, a genuine aristocrat who had gone into exile in France for his liberal and republican politics. So the boy came from the nobility, but was raised in the faith of the Enlightenment. Progress, reason, liberty, free trade. The idea that if you cleared away the old superstitions and the old tyrannies, and let rational people pursue their interests freely, the world would get better more or less forever. He trained as an engineer at the Polytechnic in Turin, wrote a doctoral thesis on the equilibrium of solid bodies, which is a detail I love because equilibrium, the balance of opposing forces, would become the obsession of his entire intellectual life. Then he ran a railway. He ran an ironworks. He was, for years, a practical man of industry who believed completely in the liberal, rational, free market vision of the 19th century. And then he watched that vision fail over and over in ways that reason could not explain, and it broke something in him, and out of the break came the machine. He became an economist, and a brilliant one. In 1893 he was given the chair of political economy at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, succeeding Leon Walras, one of the founders of modern mathematical economics. This was the top of the profession. He did foundational work that economists still use today. The concept of Pareto efficiency, a state where you cannot make anyone better off without making someone worse off, is named after him and taught in every economics department on earth. He was, by any measure, a made man at the summit of a prestigious and rational science. But he kept running into a wall. He was a passionate free trader, a believer in liberty, and he watched as democratic governments across Europe, responding to public pressure and the manoeuvring of special interests, did the opposite of what his elegant models said rational actors should do. They raised tariffs, they handed out privileges, they made decisions that were, from the standpoint of pure economic reason, insane. And they justified those decisions with soaring language about the nation and the people and justice. And Pareto had a realization that poisoned him and liberated him at the same time. The language was not the reason. The language was a decoration painted over the top of motives that had nothing to do with reason at all. People were not rational animals who occasionally made mistakes. They were driven animals who occasionally used reason as a costume. That is the seed of the whole system. He came to believe that human action is driven by deep, relatively constant, non-rational instincts which he called residues, and that everything we say to justify our actions, all our ideologies and moral philosophies and political theories, are what he called derivations. Derivations are the stories, residues are the engine, and the fatal error of every rationalist, every liberal, every person who thinks you can argue a society into being good, is to take the derivations seriously, to think the stories are the cause, when the stories are just the exhaust. Democracy, in this view, is a derivation. Liberty is a derivation. The divine right of kings was a derivation, and the rights of man is a derivation, and they are doing the same job, which is to dress up the raw fact of who holds power in clothes that make it look legitimate. Change the costume all you like. The body underneath is always the same small circle of people at the top, and the only thing that matters is what kind of people they are. You can hear the bitterness in that, and the bitterness was earned, because while he was building this cold machine of a theory, his personal life was collapsing in a way that would have made a lesser man merely sad, and made Pareto something harder and stranger. Around the turn of the century, his wife, a Russian woman named Alessandrina, left him. The accounts say she ran off with a young servant, taking a good deal of his household with her. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the trap he was in. He wanted to be free of the marriage, but Italian law at the time did not permit divorce. He was legally chained to a woman who had left him for more than 20 years, and the only way he eventually escaped it, near the very end of his life, was to acquire citizenship in a tiny short-lived state called the Free State of Fiume, which had different laws, purely so that he could annul the marriage and marry the companion who had been with him through the villa years, a Frenchwoman named Jane Regis, 30 years younger than him. Think about what that does to a man's view of human institutions. The great liberal rationalist, the believer in progress and law and reason, is personally imprisoned for 2 decades by a law that everyone agrees is absurd, unable to fix his own life through any rational appeal, forced in the end to game the system through a legal technicality in a country that barely existed. The machine he built has no room in it for the idea that good arguments win. He had learned in his own house that they do not. So he retreated. He moved to the villa in Salini above the lake, and he filled it with cats, and he wrote. And the world outside his windows was, in his final years, doing an almost theatrical impression of his theory. The First World War tore apart the confident liberal Europe he had grown up believing in, and did it for reasons that no rational calculation could justify. A continent of clever, prosperous, sophisticated nations marching millions of their young men into machine gun fire over a tangle of alliances and national feeling that was pure residue, pure instinct, dressed in the derivations of honour and duty. And then, as the war ended and the old order lay in ruins, the lions came. All across Europe, out of the wreckage of the liberal fox civilization, hard men with conviction and the willingness to use force began to rise. And in Pareto's own Italy, one of them was about to march on Rome. His name was Benito Mussolini, and his relationship to the old man in the villa is one of the most misunderstood and most dangerous parts of this entire story. And it is a large part of the reason you were never taught any of this in school. But we are not ready for that yet. First I have to show you that Pareto was not a lone crank with a grudge, because if he were, you could dismiss the machine as one bitter man's projection. The problem, the thing that should actually disturb you, is that he was not alone. Other people, working separately, sometimes as his enemies, kept discovering the same machine, and one of them found it by going looking for the exact opposite. Robert Michels was born in Cologne in 1876, into a wealthy family, and as a young man he was a passionate socialist. This matters enormously. He was not a cynic, he was not an aristocrat sneering at the masses. He was a believer in democracy in its most radical form, a man of the left who thought that ordinary people could and should govern themselves, and he threw himself into the socialist movement of his time, which was the great democratic hope of Europe, a movement explicitly dedicated to overthrowing rule by elites and replacing it with the power of the workers. And because he was a serious man, he decided to study how these democratic organizations actually worked from the inside. He picked the German Social Democratic Party, which was the largest, most sophisticated, most genuinely democratic mass party in the world at the time, a party whose entire reason for existing was to fight for equality and against the domination of the many by the few. If any human organization on Earth was going to escape rule by a small elite, it would be this one. That was the whole point of the experiment. He went looking for the place where the fox and lion machine did not run. He found that it ran there too. He found it ran everywhere, always in every organization, with a regularity so absolute that he did something a cautious academic almost never does. He called it a law, the iron law of oligarchy, and he stated it in a sentence that I think is one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the history of political thought. Who says organization says oligarchy, meaning the very act of organizing human beings to pursue any goal, no matter how democratic the goal, no matter how sincere the equality of the members, inevitably and always produces a small ruling clique that comes to dominate the organization and to run it in its own interest. The moment a group gets large enough that it cannot all fit in one room and vote on everything directly, it needs leaders, it needs full-time officials, it needs experts who understand the finances and the strategy and the history. Those people accumulate knowledge and control and relationships that ordinary members do not have. They become indispensable. They begin to have interests of their own, chief among them the interest in staying in charge. And the mass of members, who have jobs and lives and cannot possibly master all the details, defer to them, are grateful to them, and slowly lose any real power to remove them. The leaders become an elite, not through some conspiracy, through the sheer physics of organizing large numbers of people. The socialists, in other words, the people whose entire creed was the abolition of ruling elites, could not run their own party without generating one. And here is the cruelest part, the ironic parallel that I cannot stop thinking about. Robert Michels discovered the iron law that says idealistic movements always curdle into rule by a self-interested clique that betrays the founding ideals. And then Michels himself, over the following years, drifted away from his socialism and toward a new and rising force that promised order and will and force over the endless talking of parliamentary democracy. He ended up an admirer of Italian fascism. The man who proved that the pull towards strongman elites is an iron law was himself pulled by that same law out of the democratic left and toward the strongman. He could see the current perfectly. He could name it and formalize it and turn it into a law. And it carried him off anyway. Remember that. The ability to see the machine does not lift you out of the machine. It never has. That is going to matter more and more as we go, and it is going to matter most at the very end, when it is no longer about Michels, and it is about you. So now we have two men working separately, one an embittered aristocratic economist, and one a disillusioned socialist, arriving from opposite directions at the same conclusion. Society is always ruled by an elite. That elite tends towards self-interest and self-perpetuation, and the democratic escape hatch is an illusion. And they were not even the only two. There was a third Italian, Gaetano Mosca, a constitutional lawyer, who had actually gotten to the core idea before Pareto did, and who spent years furious that Pareto got the credit. Mosca argued, in a book published in 1896, that in every society there are two classes, a class that rules and a class that is ruled, and that the ruling class is always a minority and always organized, and that its organization is precisely what lets a small group dominate a large one. This is the same discovery, arrived at from yet another angle, the legal and organizational angle rather than the psychological one, and the relationship between Mosca and Pareto was poisonous. Mosca complained bitterly and publicly about the distinguished professor at Lausanne, who had somehow suffered a strange lapse of memory and failed to credit the man who thought of it first. Pareto, for his part, mostly refused to engage, and in a private letter to a mutual friend he dismissed Mosca as, and I am quoting the translation, a balloon full of hot air. Two men who agreed almost entirely about the fundamental nature of political power spent years sniping at each other over priority, which if you think about it is exactly the behaviour their shared theory would predict from two members of a competing intellectual elite. Even the discoverers of the machine could not escape acting out the machine. But here is the thing that took this from an interesting cluster of early 20th century Italian and German thinkers and turned it into something that made the hair on my neck stand up. These men thought they were discovering something new, a modern science of society. They were not. The machine had been described before. It had been described in almost exactly the same terms, with the same two types, the same cycle of cohesion and decadence, the same grim inevitability. And it had been described more than 500 years earlier in North Africa by a man most people in the West have never heard of, which is itself a small scandal. His name was Ibn Khaldun, and once you know about him, The idea that the fox and lion cycle is some quirky pet theory of a bitter Italian becomes impossible to maintain. It starts to look like one of the oldest and most independently rediscovered observations that human beings have ever made about themselves, and that is much more frightening than a pet theory. A pet theory can be wrong, a thing that reasonable people keep discovering over and over across centuries and continents and completely different cultures without knowing about each other might just be true. Ibn Khaldun was born in Tunis in 1332 into a world of Islamic dynasties in North Africa and Spain that rose and fell with a rapidity that must have made the pattern hard to miss. He was not a monk in a library. He was a working politician and diplomat, a man who served various rulers, switched sides, was imprisoned, rose and fell himself, and watched from the inside as one dynasty after another came to power, grew fat, and was destroyed. And late in his life he tried to explain what he had seen in the introduction to a massive history, a section so substantial it has its own name, the Muqaddimah, completed around 1377, and in it he laid out a theory of the rise and fall of dynasties built around a single concept that has no clean English translation. The word is Asabiyyah. It is usually rendered as group feeling, or social solidarity, or cohesion. It is the thing that makes a group of people willing to stand together, to sacrifice for one another, to fight and die as a unit rather than scatter as individuals. It is, almost exactly, what Pareto would call the persistence of aggregates. It is the lion. And Ibn Khaldun's theory goes like this. A dynasty begins with a group from the margins, often from the desert or the mountains. A hard people who have Asabiyyah in abundance because their difficult life demands it. They are cohesive, tough, loyal, and willing to fight. And with that solidarity they conquer a soft, wealthy, established dynasty that has lost its edge. So far this is the lions overrunning the foxes. But then the conquerors settle into the wealth and comfort of the civilization they have taken. The first generation still remembers the desert and keeps its solidarity. The second generation grows up in luxury, and the Asabiyyah weakens. By the third and fourth generation, the descendants of those hard, cohesive conquerors have become soft, individualistic, pleasure-seeking, and they no longer have the group feeling that won them the throne. They rule through hired soldiers and clever administrators rather than through their own cohesion. They tax their people to pay for their comfort, and they become vulnerable to the next hard, hungry group from the margins, which arrives to destroy them and begin the cycle again. Ibn Khaldun even put a rough clock on it. He said a dynasty rarely lasts beyond 3 generations, which he estimated at about 40 years each, roughly 120 years from the vigour of the founders to the collapse of their soft descendants. I want you to notice what he is doing, because it is the same move Pareto makes, and it is the move that separates all of these thinkers from the way we usually talk about the decline of nations. He is not saying the dynasties fell because the later rulers were wicked, or foolish, or made bad decisions. He is saying they fell because they succeeded. The luxury and security that success produces is precisely what dissolves the cohesion that produced the success. The decline is structural, not moral. It is baked into the victory. The seeds of the fall are the same seeds as the rise. And that is the thing that all of these people, Ibn Khaldun in the 1300s, Pareto and Mosca, and Michels in the early 1900s, keep independently arriving at, and it is the thing that makes the machine feel less like a theory and more like a law of nature. Prosperity produces foxes. Foxes produce fragility. Fragility invites the lions. It is a cycle that runs on its own success, which means you cannot fix it by being successful, and you cannot fix it by being good, and this is beginning to sound less like sociology and more like a trap with no exit, which is exactly the question we are chasing and exactly the question that refuses to close. Is there a way out? Every thinker who has looked closely has failed to find one, and I have to keep pressing on how many of them there were, because the sheer count is the thing that should be changing your mind as we go, the way it changed mine. It was not 2 Italians and a German and a medieval North African. There was a Frenchman named Georges Sorel, a contemporary of Pareto, who came at the machine from the angle of what actually moves masses of people to act, and who arrived at a conclusion that fills in the missing piece of the whole cycle. Sorel argued, in a book called Reflections on Violence published around 1908, that human beings are not moved to great collective action by rational programs or careful arguments at all. They are moved by myth, by a mobilizing image, a vision, a story that grips the imagination and makes people willing to sacrifice and to fight, and the truth or falsehood of the myth is almost beside the point, because its job is not to be true, its job is to move bodies. This is the lion's fuel, described from the inside. The foxes deal in arguments, in derivations, in reasons, and Sorel is telling you why the arguments stop working at the end. Why a society drowning in clever commentary and sophisticated reasoning suddenly lurches toward a leader or a movement, offering not a better argument, but a myth, a raw galvanizing image of renewal and enemies and destiny. Sorel even celebrated proletarian violence as something regenerative, a force that could save a soft, decadent, over-rationalized bourgeois world from rotting into what he called barbarism, and his ideas went on to feed both the revolutionary left and, uncomfortably, the fascist right, because a theory about the power of myth over reason is useful to anyone building a movement, regardless of which direction they are pointing it. Then there is the German, Oswald Spengler, who published the first volume of a vast and gloomy book called The Decline of the West right at the end of the First World War, in 1918, and who took the cycle and blew it up to the scale of entire civilizations. Spengler argued that civilizations are not machines that can run forever with good maintenance, but living organisms with a fixed lifespan that each one is born, matures, grows old, and dies on a schedule of roughly 1,000 years, passing through a springtime of vital creative culture into a winter he called, with deliberate coldness, civilization, by which he meant the sterile, sophisticated, money-driven, city-bound final phase in which a people has stopped creating and started merely calculating, in which the great questions are settled and only the management remains. He thought the West had entered that winter. And whatever you make of his mysticism, and there is plenty to argue with, the shape is the same shape. Vital cohesion at the start, sterile cleverness at the end, and the end is not a choice or a mistake, it is a stage of a life cycle as unavoidable as old age. And then there is the Englishman, Arnold Toynbee, who spent decades on an enormous comparative study of civilizations and produced a formulation that is maybe the cleanest gloss on Pareto's Fox Elite ever written by someone who was not trying to write one. Toynbee said that a rising civilization is led by what he called a creative minority, a group that earns the willing allegiance of the masses by actually solving the society's problems, by leading, by answering the challenges the world throws at it. But when that creative minority runs out of creativity, when it can no longer solve the new problems and can only defend its own position, it curdles into what he called a dominant minority, a ruling class that has lost the ability to inspire and can now command only through coercion, holding on to a power it no longer deserves through force and habit, while the allegiance of the masses drains away into what Toynbee called an internal proletariat, alienated, resentful, no longer believing. Read that as Pareto, and it is almost a translation. The creative minority that decays into a dominant minority ruling by coercion is the Fox elite that has lost its competence and its legitimacy, and has nothing left but the machinery, and the alienated internal proletariat is the accumulating pool of the excluded, the counter-elites, and the immiserated masses, waiting, so now count them. Ibn Khaldun in the 1300s, Machiavelli in the 1500s, at least in embryo, Mosca and Pareto, and Michels and Sorel, all in the same few decades around 1900, mostly working separately, sometimes as bitter rivals. Spengler and Toynbee close behind, a Tunisian statesman, a Florentine diplomat, an Italian economist, an Italian lawyer, a German sociologist, a French engineer, a German historian, an English one. Different centuries, different cultures, different religions, different politics, different starting assumptions, and they keep walking into the same room and finding the same machine already running in it. When one person tells you the elite decays and the cycle turns, you can call it a theory. When a dozen people across 600 years, who mostly never read each other, keep arriving at the identical structure from every possible direction, you are no longer looking at a theory. You are looking at something much more like a law, and the law has no exception clause that anyone has ever managed to find. Let me show you the places where they looked hardest, the actual historical cases, because this is where the pattern stops being a philosophy and starts being a body count. Start with Rome, because Rome is the case that these thinkers had in the back of their minds the whole time, and because the Roman Republic did something that should terrify anyone who thinks a stable, admired, long-lasting political order is safe. It ran, in one form or another, for nearly 500 years. It was sophisticated, legalistic, proud of its constitution, governed by a senate full of the cleverest political operators the ancient world produced, men who were masters of exactly the fox arts. Coalition building, legal manoeuvring, patronage, the manipulation of religious ritual for political ends, the endless subtle negotiation among competing aristocratic families. The Roman senatorial class was a fox elite of the highest order, and for centuries it worked. And then, in the span of about 100 years, the whole thing came apart, and it came apart along precisely the fault line Pareto described. The foxes lost control of force, and the lions took it. The crack begins, most historians agree, with two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Tiberius was a tribune who in 133 BC tried to push through land reforms to help the poor citizens who were being squeezed out by the wealthy. The details of the policy matter less than what happened to him. The senatorial elite, unable to stop him through the normal fox channels of legal and political manoeuvre, resorted to something the Republic had managed to avoid for centuries in its internal politics. They killed him. A mob led by senators beat Tiberius Gracchus to death and threw his body in the Tiber. His brother Gaius took up the cause, and about 12 years later, in 121 BC, he too was killed, along with thousands of his supporters. And something had changed that could never be changed back. Political violence, murder as a tool of domestic politics, had entered the Roman system, and once it was in, it could not be removed. The fox elite had reached for the lion's weapon, and in doing so it had signed the Republic's death warrant, because now the question of who ruled Rome would increasingly be settled not by senatorial cunning, but by force, and the people best at force were not the clever old senators. They were the generals. Here come the lions. Gaius Marius, a military man, a brilliant general, an outsider to the old aristocracy, was elected consul in 107 BC and went on to hold that office an unprecedented 7 times, riding his command of the army and the loyalty of his soldiers straight through the constitutional norms the Fox Senate had spent centuries maintaining. And then came the man who makes the whole thing unmistakable, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla did what had been unthinkable. He marched a Roman army on the city of Rome itself, twice, and the second time, around 82 BC, he made himself dictator and then did something with a chilling bureaucratic quality to it. He published lists, prescriptions they were called, lists of names posted in the forum, of Romans who were now declared enemies of the state, who could be killed on sight, whose property would be seized, and, in a detail that tells you everything about how total this was, anyone who sheltered a proscribed man was to be killed as well. Thousands of the Roman elite, senators and wealthy knights, were hunted down and murdered, their heads reportedly displayed, their estates handed to Sulla's supporters. The historian Plutarch, writing later, stressed that there was no precedent for this, no law that governed it, that Sulla was inventing state terror as he went. The Fox Republic, which had ruled the Mediterranean world through law and cunning, was now a place where a general posted death lists in the public square. And on one of those lists, as a young man, was the name of a relative of Marius, a young aristocrat named Julius Caesar, who barely escaped, whose inheritance was confiscated, and who would go on, one generation later, to finish what Sulla started and turn the corpse of the Republic into the body of an empire ruled by one man with a sword. The foxes had run Rome for 5 centuries. It took the lions about 80 years to eat them. Now I have to be honest with you here, because this audience does not tolerate a story that is too clean, and the honest version is actually more unsettling than the clean one. The labels I have been using, the Roman equivalents of foxes and populists, the optimates and the populares, were never neat parties. They were fluid, shifting alliances, and Roman politicians moved between them and used the language of the people or the language of the Senate as it suited them. Cicero called himself a defender of the traditional order while using popular tactics when he needed to. The sources we have are written almost entirely by the elite, so they are biased. The point is not that Rome had a fox party and a lion party with membership cards. The point is deeper than that. The point is that the underlying dynamic Pareto described, the loss of the fox elite's monopoly on force and its replacement by men whose power came from raw violence and personal loyalty, is visible in the wreckage, no matter how you slice the political labels. The machine does not need the labels to be clean, it runs underneath them. But if Rome feels too ancient, too far away to touch you, let me bring it forward more than 1,000 years, to a country and a revolution that still shapes how the modern world thinks about politics, and watch the identical machine run again. France. In the 1780s, the Ancien Regime, the old order of the French monarchy, was in its final decades one of the most sophisticated fox civilizations that had ever existed. Versailles was the beating heart of it, a world of exquisite manners, brilliant conversation, philosophical salons, and above all financial and administrative complexity. The French state was run by an enormous apparatus of officials, tax farmers and financiers, a machine of astonishing cunning and astonishing corruption. And it was going broke. The crisis that actually brought down the French monarchy was not, in the first instance, a crisis of ideas or of oppression. It was a financial crisis. The crown was drowning in debt, much of it from wars, and it could not balance its books. It cycled through finance minister after finance minister, each one a fox brought in to work some clever magic on the numbers. The most famous of them a Swiss banker named Jacques Necker, and none of them could solve it, because the problem was structural and the fox elite had no stomach for the brutal choices that might have fixed it. The clever men had run out of clever solutions, and when the foxes at the top of a society run out of tricks, the machine does what it always does. It reaches for the lions. And France produced a lion of a particularly pure and terrifying kind. Not a general, at first, but a lawyer, a fastidious, incorruptible provincial lawyer named Maximilien Robespierre, who came to embody a politics that was everything the fox elite was not. Where they were cynical, he was a fanatic of virtue. Where they compromised, he was absolute. Where they recoiled from force, he embraced it as the necessary instrument of a pure new order. And in 1793 and 1794, Robespierre and his allies gave France the Terror, a period in which the machinery of the state was turned to the systematic killing of the enemies of the revolution, real and imagined, with the guillotine as its efficient centerpiece. Here is where Pareto's own words become almost unbearable, because decades before he built his full system. In an earlier book, he had written a line about exactly this moment in history, and I want to give it to you as close to his phrasing as the translation allows. He wrote that the knife of the guillotine was being sharpened in the shadows, while at the end of the 18th century, the ruling classes of France were busy developing their sensibility. Think about that image. The clever, refined humanitarian elite up in the salons, congratulating themselves on their feelings, on their sensitivity, on how enlightened and gentle they had become, while down in the dark the blade that would take their heads was already being honed. That is the Fox elite in its final phase, in one sentence. Softness at the top, the blade in the shadow, and Pareto's brutal verdict, which he stated flatly, was that any elite which is not prepared to fight to defend its position is in full decadence. The French aristocracy had lost the will to fight, and so it died, and the men who killed it were the lions the machine had been manufacturing at the bottom of the society the whole time the salons were admiring their own sensibility. And notice how the French cycle completes itself, because it completes itself in the most Parisian way imaginable. The Terror burned out, Robespierre himself went to the guillotine, and out of the chaos rose the ultimate lion, a young artillery officer with limitless will and no hesitation whatsoever about the use of force, who seized power in 1799 and crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1804. Napoleon, the revolution that began with the failure of the Fox financiers, ended with an emperor on a battlefield. Force had returned to the centre of French life, wearing a crown it made for itself. The circle had closed, and the ordinary people of France, in whose name the whole thing had supposedly been done, were still, at the end of it, the ruled and not the rulers. A new elite sat at the top. The board had not become the players had simply been replaced. I could keep doing this. I could take you through the English Civil War of the 1640s, where a rising commercial and parliamentary class, lawyers and merchants and gentry, skilled in exactly the fox arts of law and money and negotiation, contended with a king over taxes and authority and religion, and the whole clever constitutional struggle spiralled, as these things do once force enters, past anyone's ability to control it. It ended, in the end, the way the machine says it ends, not with a legal settlement, but with a man on a horse at the head of an army. Oliver Cromwell, who had raised and disciplined a force of soldiers bound together by iron religious conviction, the new model army, a lion's instrument if there ever was one, and who used it first to defeat the king, then to have the king executed, and finally to sweep aside by armed force the very parliament that had made him, walking into the chamber with soldiers at his back and clearing the members out, before ruling the country as Lord Protector, a military strongman wearing a Puritan collar instead of a crown. And Turchin, when he ran his numbers backward, found that England in the decades before that civil war showed exactly the signature his model looks for, a bloated overproduction of gentry and educated aspirants competing for a fixed number of positions, immiseration of the common people, a crown going broke, the stress index climbing toward the red. The machine again, in another century, in another country, wearing another costume, ending the same way. But before I bring this into your own lifetime, I have to give you the one case that sits closest to the modern world in time and that the audience for this kind of thing most needs to sit inside, because it is the case where a sophisticated, liberal, financialized fox civilization collapsed into the most extreme lion regime in human history, and it did so within living memory of people your grandparents knew, and the mechanism is laid out in it like a diagram. Germany, the Weimar Republic, the democratic Germany that rose out of the defeat of the First World War, was in many ways the most advanced, most cultured, most liberal society on earth in the 1920s. Berlin was the intellectual and artistic capital of the world. It had brilliant science, radical art, sexual freedom, a free press of dazzling sophistication, cabaret and cinema and philosophy, a fox civilization in full late bloom, clever and tolerant and experimental, and proud of exactly those things. And it was sitting on a financial foundation that was about to be vaporized. In 1923, Germany experienced one of the most extreme hyperinflations ever recorded. The value of the German mark did not just fall, it disintegrated. At the start of the crisis, a dollar bought a few thousand marks. By November of 1923, a single dollar was worth something on the order of 4.2 trillion marks. People were paid twice a day and ran to spend the money before it lost value between the morning and the afternoon. Life savings. The patient accumulated wealth of the entire cautious, thrifty rentier middle class. The lion savers Pareto described. The people who had done everything right and put their money away and trusted the system were annihilated in a matter of months, converted into wheelbarrows of worthless paper. And I want you to feel the exact Parisian horror of that, because it is precise. The hyperinflation was in effect the fox economy destroying the lion economy in its purest form. The financial system, the world of money and speculation and paper, reached into the savings of the solid, trusting, conservative middle class and turned it all to nothing. And in doing so, it did not just impoverish those people, it detonated their faith in the entire liberal order, in democracy, in finance, in reason, in the promise that if you were prudent and law-abiding you would be safe. That faith is the glue of a fox civilization, and in 1923, in Germany, it dissolved. And here is where I have to stop you, because the lazy version of this story gets the timing wrong in a way that actually matters, and this audience deserves the honest mechanism. It is tempting to draw a straight line from the hyperinflation of 1923 to the Nazi seizure of power, and to say the money died and then the monster came. But that is not what happened, and the real sequence is more disturbing, not less. In November of 1923, in the middle of the currency collapse, an obscure agitator named Adolf Hitler did attempt to seize power in the beer hall putsch in Munich, and he failed, and it was farcical, and he went to prison, and the Republic survived, and the currency was stabilized, and for about 5 years Germany actually recovered, and the fox civilization glittered on. The wound of 1923 did not immediately kill the patient. It did something worse. It left a scar, a permanent loss of faith in the liberal order among millions of ruined middle-class people, a dry field waiting for a spark. And the spark came a decade later, with a second and separate economic shock, the Great Depression, which hit Germany with catastrophic force around 1930 and 1931, throwing millions out of work and finishing off whatever trust in the liberal fox order the hyperinflation had left standing. And it was then, in 1933, on the second collapse, not the first, that the lions finally came all the way in, that the most extreme force-oriented movement of the modern age took power over one of the most sophisticated societies that had ever existed. The fox civilization of Weimar did not fall because it was stupid. It was the opposite of stupid. It fell because its financial foundation was destroyed. Twice. and because in its cleverness and its tolerance and its endless sophisticated argument, it had lost the capacity to defend itself against the force that its own collapse was breeding in the streets, and because the ruined and the frightened and the excluded stopped wanting a better argument and started wanting a lion. That is not a comfortable story, and I am not going to make it one. It is the machine running through the most advanced society of its day, ending in the darkest place the machine has ever gone. But I want to bring it even closer to home now, into living memory, into a case so clean that when I first really looked at it, I felt the floor tilt, because it is not ancient history and it is not a metaphor. It is the most literal fox to lion transition of the modern age, and it happened to a superpower, and most of it happened on television while the world watched, and almost nobody named what they were seeing. The Soviet Union, by the 1970s and 80s, was run by a fox elite of a very particular and very sterile kind. Not financiers, obviously, in a system that had abolished finance, but something structurally identical. A vast managerial bureaucracy. The nomenklatura, they were called, the list of people approved for positions of responsibility. A self-perpetuating caste of administrators and party officials and technical experts who ran every factory, every ministry, every institution through paperwork and connections and the endless manipulation of a planned economy. They were the ultimate managerial class, governing not through conviction, which had long since drained out of the system, and certainly not through the raw force of the early Bolshevik years, which had congealed into something grey and procedural, but through administration, through the pulling of bureaucratic strings, through knowing the right people and filling out the right forms. And like every fox elite, they presided over a system that grew steadily more sophisticated on paper and steadily more hollow underneath, until the conviction that had once held it together was simply gone, and the whole structure in 1991 astonished the world by collapsing almost without a shot, because there was no one left who believed in it enough to fight for it. A superpower dissolved because its ruling class had become pure fox, pure management, with no lion left anywhere in the building to defend the walls. And then, watch what came next, because it is the machine completing its turn in real time. The 1990s in Russia were a chaotic explosion of the most extreme fox behaviour imaginable. A decade of oligarchs and speculators and financial manipulators seizing the assets of the collapsed state through schemes of breathtaking cunning, a wild orgy of combination and deal-making while ordinary Russians were plunged into poverty and disorder. Pure fox chaos, unrestrained, and out of that chaos, the country reached, exactly as the machine predicts, for a lion. It reached for order, for force, for conviction, for a strong hand, and the man who provided it came not from the world of finance or management, but from the world of force itself, from the security services, from the KGB. Vladimir Putin. And the class of people he brought with him into the commanding heights of the Russian state has a name in Russian. And the name is so perfect that when I learnt it I actually laughed out loud, a short unhappy laugh, because Pareto could not have designed it better if he had been writing fiction. They are called the Siloviki. The word comes from the Russian word sila, which means force, or strength, or power. The Siloviki. The men of force. A ruling class of former security and military and intelligence officers, defined by that word force, taking over a state from the exhausted managerial foxes who had run it into the ground. Pareto's class 2, the persistence of aggregates, the men of force and cohesion and conviction, made flesh, given a name in a living language, moving into power in a nuclear-armed state within our own lifetimes. Now, once again, I owe you the honest complication, because the clean version is a trap, and this audience knows it. Recent scholarship, a study by Snegovaya and Petrov published in 2022 that traced the backgrounds of Putin's top 100 or so elites, found something that at first looks like it undercuts the story, and actually, when you sit with it, makes it darker. They found that around 60% of Putin's inner elite come from the old Soviet nomenklatura, or from nomenklatura families, a group that was only 1 to 3% of the Soviet population. In other words, the men of force who took over were not, for the most part, hard outsiders storming the gates. They were substantially the children and heirs of the old managerial elite, the same families recirculated, wearing new uniforms. And this is not a flaw in Pareto's theory. This is Pareto's theory. Remember what circulation of elites actually means. It does not mean the masses rise. It means the elite reshuffles, changes its character, changes the balance of foxes and lions within itself, while the fundamental gap between the rulers and the ruled stays exactly where it was. The Russian case is not a revolution from below. It is a governing class shifting its own internal balance from fox to lion, from management to force, while the ordinary Russian remains, as ever, part of the board and not one of the players. That is the machine running at its most precise, and it ran in front of all of us, on the news, and the number of people who publicly connected it to a theory formalized in 1916 you could probably count on your hands. Which brings me to the question I have been circling, the one that should be making you angry by now if you are the kind of person who gets angry at the right things. If this machine is real, if it has been described independently across 6 centuries, if it visibly ran through Rome and France and the Soviet collapse and a dozen other cases, then why is it not part of how educated people are taught to understand politics? Why did you have to find it in a 2-hour video instead of in a classroom? Why is the standard way we talk about history, the story of progress and ideas, and the gradual expansion of freedom, so completely silent about a mechanism that these serious thinkers considered the master key? And the answer, the real answer, is one of the more uncomfortable pieces of intellectual history I know, and it has 2 parts, and both of them should bother you. The first part is that the theory got poisoned by association, and the poison had a name, and the name was fascism. Remember where we left Pareto, in his villa, in his final years, as Mussolini rose. Mussolini, as a young radical, had actually read and admired the elite theorists. He praised Pareto's ideas. He absorbed the notion that democracy is a sham, a derivation, a mask over the permanent reality of elite rule, and that the honest thing to do was to seize power openly through will and force rather than to pretend that the people were really in charge. When Mussolini took power in the March on Rome in 1922, the new regime looked around for intellectual ancestors, for prophets who had foreseen and justified it, and Pareto. The famous old economist who had written that liberal democracy was a fraud, and that force was the ultimate arbiter, was an obvious candidate. In 1923, the fascist government nominated Pareto to the Italian Senate. Fascist writers began to call him the forerunner, the prophet, and eventually he was tagged with a phrase that stuck to his corpse, like tar. The Karl Marx of fascism. And Pareto died that same year, in August of 1923, less than a year after the March on Rome, before he could see what the thing he had been associated with would become, and before he could say very much about whether he actually endorsed it. And here is where the honest history matters. Because the lazy version, the version that let the academic world quietly bury this whole tradition, is that Pareto was a fascist, and therefore his ideas are fascist, and therefore we can safely ignore them. That is not what the careful scholarship says. The most cited work on this question, an article by the economist Renato Cirio published in 1983, argues that Pareto remained, in his own political convictions, a radical libertarian to the very end, a lover of individual liberty who despised state coercion, and that there are strong reasons to believe that had he lived longer, he would have revolted against fascism as it revealed its true nature. Pareto welcomed some things about the early regime: its willingness to break the parliamentary deadlock, its restoration of order, its contempt for the hypocrisies of the liberal politicians he had spent his life despising. But he also, in his final writings, warned the new regime against exactly the things it would go on to do, against censorship, against the suppression of academic freedom, against militarism. The story that Mussolini attended Pareto's lectures in Lausanne and sat at the feet of the master is repeated everywhere and appears to be a myth with no solid evidence behind it. The reality is that Pareto was a genuinely ambiguous figure, a man whose cold analysis of power could be picked up and used by people he might well have despised, which is a danger that comes with any theory that tells the truth about power, because the truth about power is useful to the people who want it. But ambiguity does not make a good story, and it does not protect a reputation, and after the Second World War, when fascism lay in ruins and its intellectual associations were radioactive, the entire tradition of elite theory, Pareto and Mosca and Michel's together, was pushed to the margins of respectable thought, tainted, avoidable, the kind of thing a careful academic simply did not build a career on. Not because it was disproven, it was never disproven. Because it was uncomfortable, and because it had kept bad company, and those two things together were enough to bury it. That is the first part of the answer, and it should already trouble you, because notice what actually happened there. A set of ideas was removed from mainstream discussion, not because anyone showed the ideas were wrong, but because the implications were unwelcome and the associations were toxic. That is the exact mechanism by which uncomfortable truths get quietly filed away. And it is worth being angry about, because it means the version of political reality you were handed was curated for your comfort and for the comfort of the people doing the handing. And I want to be precise about that mechanism, because the word suppression makes people picture something dramatic, a banning, a burning, a committee voting to erase a dangerous book, and that is not how it works, and imagining it that way lets the real process off the hook. Nobody banned Pareto. The 4 volumes of the treatise sat in the libraries the whole time, and still do. You could always walk in and read them. What happened is quieter and more total than a ban. The ideas were simply allowed to become unfashionable, unserious. The kind of thing a young scholar building a career learns not to be caught taking too seriously, and that is a far more effective form of burial than any bonfire, because it leaves no ash, no martyr, no obvious act of censorship to point at and protest. The book is right there on the shelf, and everyone has quietly agreed that only a certain kind of person takes it down. The dangerous idea does not get killed. It gets socially quarantined, marked with the invisible label of not quite respectable, and left to gather dust in plain sight while the acceptable frameworks, the ones that flatter the existing order and locate the engine of history and ideas and progress, and the gradual expansion of rights, rather than in the cold circulation of elites, get taught to every student and printed in every popular history. It is the perfect crime, because there is no crime. There is only a room full of clever people all independently deciding, for the sake of their own comfort and their own careers, not to look directly at the one theory that is looking directly at them. And the result is that a framework serious enough to have been independently discovered across 6 centuries, and precise enough to have generated a forecast in nature that came true, is known to almost no one, and the people who most need to understand it, which is everyone living inside a late Fox civilization, meaning you, were simply never handed the key. But the second part of the answer is stranger, and I think deeper, and it is the part that turns this from a story about the past into a story about you. sitting there right now. Because the second reason nobody in authority connects these dots is that the people in authority are the foxes. The theory is about them, and you cannot expect the fox elite to teach the population the theory that predicts the fox elite's destruction. It is not even a conspiracy. It is just that the people who staff the universities, the media, the commentariat, the entire apparatus that decides what counts as serious political understanding are themselves the credentialed, clever, persuasion-based class that the theory identifies as the foxes in their late and vulnerable phase. Asking them to make Pareto's machine common knowledge is like asking a man to narrate, in detail and with enthusiasm, the mechanism of his own coming death. Of course it is not on the syllabus. The syllabus is written by the animal the machine is about to select against. I told you that would come back, the idea that the people who can see the pattern are the ones it consumes. We are getting closer to it now. But I have been giving you the historical cases, the safely dead examples, Rome and France and even the Soviet collapse, which is recent but still finished, still over, still something that happened to other people over there. I have been doing that on purpose, the way you approach a frightened animal from the side, because now I have to turn the machine to face the one direction you have been hoping I would not turn it. I have to point it at right now, at the society you are living in, and ask the question that the whole tradition, from Ibn Khaldun to Pareto to the man we are about to meet, was really built to answer. Not what happened to them, what is happening to us? Where are we on the clock? And the reason this question stopped being philosophy and started being something closer to a countdown is that in our own time, someone took Pareto's machine, which was always a qualitative story, a matter of types and tendencies, and did something to it that Pareto never could. He put numbers on it. He made it measurable. He made it, in the most disturbing sense of the word, predictive. And then he used it to make a prediction, in print, in one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, about the decade we just lived through. And the prediction came true. His name is Peter Turchin, and his path to this is so unlikely that it is worth a moment, because it changes how much weight the prediction can bear. Turchin did not start as a historian or a political scientist. He started as a population biologist. His early career was spent studying the boom and bust cycles of animal populations, the way the numbers of voles or beetles or moths surge and crash over time in patterns that can be captured with mathematics, with differential equations, with the tools of a hard quantitative science. And at some point around the turn of the millennium he had the thought that reoriented his entire life, which was that human societies might be susceptible to the same kind of mathematical treatment, that the rise and fall of political order might be a dynamical system with measurable drivers and detectable cycles. Exactly like a population of animals in an ecosystem. He gave the new discipline a name, Cliodynamics, from Clio, the muse of history, and dynamics, the science of change. And the core of what he built is, whether or not he would put it this way, Pareto's machine translated into the language of data. Turchin's model has a few key drivers, and I want to give them to you precisely, because the precision is the point, and because each one maps onto the old theory in a way that should raise the hair on your arms. The first driver he calls popular immiseration. It means the mass of ordinary people getting poorer, or at least stagnating, while the cost of a decent life rises, the slow grinding erosion of the living standards of the many. The second, and this is the one that matters most, he calls elite overproduction, and this is Pareto's clogged circulation given a hard, countable form. Elite overproduction means that a society starts producing far more people who expect to be elite, who have the credentials and the ambition and the sense of entitlement to a place at the top than there are actual elite positions to hold them. You mint 10 times as many people who believe they are destined to rule, or at least to be comfortable and important, as you have room for at the top. And most of them, necessarily, are disappointed. You generate a large, growing, educated, frustrated class of people who were promised a place in the elite and did not get one. Turchin has a name for what these people become when the frustration curdles. He calls them counter-elites, ambitious, capable, credentialed people, locked out of the establishment, who turn their talents and their rage against the system that excluded them, and become the leaders of popular discontent. And if you are hearing an echo, you should be, because that is Pareto's exact description. From paragraph 2178 of a book written 100 years earlier, of the superior elements accumulating in the lower strata, the capable and force-ready people that the closed fox elite refuses to admit, piling up at the bottom, waiting. The engine that drives elite overproduction in our own time has a name that you will recognize the moment I say it, because you have probably lived it. Credential inflation. A society tells its young people that the path to a good life, to security, to status, to a seat at the table, runs through education, through degrees, through credentials, and so more and more of them acquire more and more education, and the entirely predictable thing happens, which is that the credentials become worth less and less precisely because more people have them. The bachelor's degree that once guaranteed a place in the professional class becomes the new baseline, so you need a master's, and then the master's saturates and you need the doctorate or the professional degree, and at every stage the aspirants take on more debt and more years and more deferred life in pursuit of a promise that the math guarantees cannot be kept for most of them. Because the number of genuinely elite positions, the good jobs, the secure careers, the seats at the top did not multiply to match. You end up with a vast population of highly educated, deeply indebted, intensely ambitious people who did everything they were told to do and find the door shut, and who are, understandably, furious. That fury is not a character flaw. It is fuel. It is the raw material of Turchin's counter-elites, and it is Pareto's superior elements piling up in the lower strata given a specific and very modern shape. Now I want to be honest with you here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that a careful person should push on, and pushing on it makes it stronger rather than weaker. There is a real argument among economists about whether there is literally a glut of doctorates, an actual oversupply of people with the highest credentials. Some of them point out that the median earnings of people with advanced degrees have held up or even risen, and that the misery of the academic job market, the armies of adjuncts teaching for poverty wages, reflects not too many PhDs, but the deliberate gutting of stable academic jobs, a different problem. That is a fair challenge, and I am not going to wave it away, but notice that it does not actually touch the core mechanism, because the mechanism was never really about the raw count of degrees. It is about the gap between the number of people who have been led to expect elite status and the number of elite slots that actually exist, and that gap is real, and it is widening, and it is most savage in exactly the fields, law and media and academia and the professions, that produce the articulate, credentialed, ambitious people most capable of becoming leaders of discontent. You do not need a literal surplus of doctorates to overproduce counter-elites. You only need to promise far more people a place at the top than the top can hold, and then watch what the disappointed do with their talents. The third driver Turchin tracks is the condition of the state itself, its solvency, its capacity, whether it is going broke, which you will recall is exactly how the French Fox regime fell. And he combines these drivers, immiseration, elite overproduction, state weakness, into a single measure he calls the political stress index, and when he ran that index across long stretches of history, across the Roman Empire and medieval England and France and the United States, he found that it rose and fell in long waves, and that the peaks of the index, the moments of maximum stress, lined up with the actual historical outbreaks of instability, revolution, civil war, and elite bloodletting. He found the graveyard, and he found that it fills on a schedule, and the schedule can be calculated in advance. In the books where he lays this out in full, one called Secular Cycles that he wrote with a colleague, and another about American history called Ages of Discord, he describes a structure that is eerily close to Ibn Khaldun's generations, only measured and dated and graphed. The long wave, the secular cycle, runs something like 2 to 3 centuries from the health of a society through its overpopulation and elite bloat and immiseration into a crisis and a collapse, and then a new integration. And riding on top of that long wave, he found a shorter oscillation, a roughly 50-year rhythm of rising and falling violence that he links in a detail that would have made Ibn Khaldun nod to the succession of generations. A generation that lives through a bout of civil violence recoils from it, raises children who are cautious about conflict, and those children hold things together. But then their children, 2 generations removed from the last bloodshed, grow up without the memory, without the visceral fear of what disorder actually costs, and become willing to reach for it again. The fear of the fire fades in exactly the time it takes for the people who felt its heat to die off. Ibn Khaldun measured his cycle in the fading of a desert people's cohesion over 3 generations of luxury. Turchin measures it in the fading of a society's memory of its own last collapse over the same handful of generations, and comes to the same place, which is that the very healing of a wound sets the clock for the next one, because healing means forgetting, and forgetting means the guard comes down, which is what let him do the thing that should have been front-page news, and instead was read by a few thousand specialists and forgotten by everyone else. In the year 2010, the journal Nature, one of the 2 or 3 most prestigious scientific publications on the planet, invited Turchin to contribute a short piece, and in it, in volume 463, on page 608, he made a forecast. He wrote that the next decade, the 2010s rolling into the 2020s, was likely to be a period of growing instability in the United States and Western Europe. He named the drivers explicitly: stagnating or declining real wages, a growing gap between rich and poor, an overproduction of young people with advanced degrees, too many credentialed aspirants and not enough elite slots, and exploding public debt. And he said, on the basis of his structural demographic model, that these pressures look set to peak in the years around 2020. He wrote that in 2010, a decade in advance. In Nature, and then the 2010s happened, and the wage stagnation deepened, and the wealth gap widened, and the credentialed and frustrated multiplied, and the debt exploded, and the political temperature of the Western world rose year over year toward exactly the kind of instability he had named, cresting into the early 2020s in a way that anyone who lived through it felt in their body, whether or not they had ever heard the word Cliodynamics. He does not claim to have predicted any specific event. That is not what the model does. It does not tell you the date of the fire. It tells you the forest is dry and getting drier, and that the drying follows a curve, and the curve was pointing here at now, and it was published and dated and sitting in the archive of nature the whole time, and almost nobody wanted to look at what it actually meant. So let me make the number that sits under all of this as concrete and undeniable as I can, because this is the point where the machine stops being about them and becomes about you, and I do not want you to be able to wave it away as theory. I want to show you that the West right now is a fox civilization in its late phase, by the numbers, and the clearest single place to see it is in what happened to the thing that sits at the very top of the modern economy, which is finance. Because remember what the foxes are, in Pareto's original economic sense. They are the speculators, the people who make wealth through the manipulation and combination of money rather than through the production of things. And you can actually measure how large that class has grown relative to the rest of the economy, how far the balance has tipped from the lions who build and hold toward the foxes who scheme and move, and the measurement is stark. In the United States, in 1950, the financial sector, banking and insurance and the rest of it, accounted for a bit under 3% of the entire economy, around 2.8% of gross domestic product. That is a society where finance is a servant of the real economy, a plumbing system that moves money to where things get made. By 1980, that share had grown to nearly 5%. By 2006, on the eve of the great financial crisis, it had reached 8.3%. The share of the economy occupied by the pure fox activity of moving and multiplying money had roughly tripled in 2 generations. And if you look not at the size of the sector, but at its share of all the profits in the economy, at how much of the total reward was flowing to the money movers rather than to everyone else, the numbers are even more dramatic, and, depending on which measure you trust, even more extreme. By the most cited academic estimates, the financial sector's share of total corporate profits in America grew from around 14% in 1980 to nearly 40% by 2003. On broader measures, the peak runs higher still. I am giving you a range on purpose, because different ways of counting give different peaks. And I would rather tell you it is somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 than pretend to a false precision, but the direction is not in dispute, and the direction is the whole story. The commanding heights of the Western economy shifted, over the exact decades in question, away from the people who make things and toward the people who arrange money. The society tipped toward the foxes. It is not a metaphor, it is in the national accounts. And it is not only finance. Look at who actually runs the institutions of modern life. The corporations and the agencies and the universities and the great non-profits, and you find a class of people who rule not by owning and not by fighting, but by managing, by credential, by expertise, by the mastery of process and metrics and the right language. A whole stratum sometimes called the professional managerial class, a credentialed administrative elite that governs through the manipulation of systems and symbols rather than through either production or force. This is a fox class in the purest form the world has ever produced, and it is enormous. And it staffs the very institutions that decide what counts as knowledge, which is the reason, if you circle all the way back, that this machine is not taught. The foxes run the school, and they rule, above all, through the management of what you are allowed to believe, which is the fox's supreme art and the thing that should make the hair stand up on the back of your neck the next time you notice it happening. A lion elite rules through the visible threat of force. Everyone knows where the power is, because the power is a man with a weapon and a willingness to use it. A fox elite rules through something far more comfortable and far harder to see, which is the shaping of the story, the setting of the terms of debate, the quiet decision about which questions are serious and which are fringe, which experts are credible and which are cranks, what the acceptable range of opinion is on any given subject. It rules through narrative, through the framing of reality itself, through 1,000 soft persuasions that never once show you a fist, because they never need to. And here is the part that connects directly to the specific hunger that brought you to something like this in the first place. The sense you may already carry that the official version of things is sanitized, smoothed, missing the uncomfortable center. That instinct is not paranoia. It is an accurate perception of how a persuasion-based elite actually operates. A ruling class whose entire mode of power is the management of belief will, as naturally as breathing, produce a public version of reality that is calmer, cleaner, and more flattering to the existing order than the real one. Not through some grand coordinated conspiracy, which is not how it works and never has been, but through the ordinary daily incentives of thousands of clever people who all understand, without ever being told, which conclusions are rewarded and which ones end careers. The sanitized version is not imposed. It emerges. It is what a fox civilization sounds like when it talks to itself. And the reason a theory like Pareto's feels forbidden, feels like something you were not supposed to find, is that it is one of the few frameworks that describes the persuasion machine from the outside, that treats the official story not as the truth to be learned, but as a derivation to be seen through, and a persuasion-based elite has no natural place in its own institutions for a body of. Thought whose entire function is to reveal that the persuasion is persuasion. Of course it is not on the syllabus. It is a key to a door the people who print the syllabus would rather you did not know was locked. And here I have to name someone we passed by earlier, because he saw this specific development coming with unusual clarity. And his own life is a small perfect example of the whole pattern of vision and helplessness that this tradition keeps generating. His name was James Burnham, an American, born in 1905, a brilliant and restless man, who in the 1930s was a leading American Trotskyist, a revolutionary Marxist who actually corresponded with Trotsky himself. And then, at the start of the 1940s, Burnham broke with Marxism entirely and wrote a book published in 1941 called The Managerial Revolution, in which he argued that both the Marxists and the capitalists were wrong about the future. Power was not going to end up with the workers, and it was not going to stay with the old owners of capital either. It was going to pass to a new class: the managers, the administrators, the technicians, the bureaucrats, the people who actually controlled the running of the great organizations, regardless of who legally owned them. He saw this new managerial class rising simultaneously in the Soviet Union, in Nazi Germany, and in the America of the New Deal. Three systems that looked like opposites, but that Burnham thought were all being taken over by the same kind of person underneath: the manager, the fox, in an office. That book was read closely by George Orwell, and its vision of a world carved up among managerial superstates fed directly into the world of 1984. And Burnham, 3 years later, in 1943, wrote another book called The Machiavellians, in which he did for the English-speaking world exactly what I have been doing for you. He dug up Pareto and Mosca and Michels and Sorel, the whole buried tradition, and laid out their machine, and argued, with a straight face and considerable nerve, that these cold-eyed analysts of elite domination were actually the true defenders of freedom, because only a society that understands how power really works has any chance of protecting liberty against it. Burnham spent the rest of his life on the political right, helped found a major conservative magazine, and received a high civilian honour near the end of his life before he died in 1987. Here is the man who most clearly saw the managerial fox class coming decades early and named it and warned about it. And the class arrived anyway, exactly as he described, and it now runs the Western world, and his warning changed nothing, and most educated people have never heard his name. The vision did not grant the power to stop what was seen. It never does. That is starting to sound like a refrain, and it is a refrain, and I promise you it resolves into something specific and personal before we are done. So let me assemble what we now have, because the pieces are all on the table and the picture they make is not comfortable. We have a Western elite that is, by the numbers, a mature fox class, financialized, managerial, credentialed, ruling through persuasion and expertise and the management of opinion rather than through production or force. Exactly the profile Pareto said marks a ruling class in its late and vulnerable phase. We have popular immiseration, the stagnation of ordinary living standards, measurable and real. We have elite overproduction on a scale that may be historically unprecedented, a vast machine of higher education pumping out credentialed aspirants who were promised a place near the top and are increasingly finding the door closed, generating precisely the frustrated, capable, resentful counter-elites that both Pareto and Turchin identify as the raw material of upheaval. We have a wealth pump, and I want to give that concept its full weight because it is the mechanical heart of the modern version of the crisis, and Turchin calls it, without hyperbole, one of the most destabilizing social mechanisms known to humanity. A wealth pump is any arrangement in a society that steadily moves wealth from the bottom and the middle toward the top. Not through a single act of theft, but through the slow grinding operation of the normal rules, year after year, decade after decade. In our own time, the pump has run mainly through the long stagnation of ordinary wages, while the returns to capital and to the very top have soared, so that the productivity of workers kept climbing, while the pay for that productivity flatlined, and the difference flowed upward. Turchin dates the switching on of the modern American wealth pump to roughly the late 1970s, the end of the post-war decades when wages and productivity had risen together, and the beginning of what he calls a second Gilded Age, an echo of the first great age of inequality and unrest in the late 1800s. And here is why the pump is not just unfair, but structurally dangerous, why it is the engine of the whole crisis, rather than merely a symptom. It does two destabilizing things at once. At the bottom it produces immiseration, the slow erosion of ordinary life that breeds mass discontent, and at the top it produces the surplus wealth that funds elite overproduction, that pays for the extra mansions and the extra credentials and the extra aspirants to elite status, inflating the number of people competing for the fixed number of seats at the top. The same pump that grinds down the many also swells the ranks of the frustrated few. It builds the immiserated mass and the surplus counter elites in the same motion, loading both barrels of the crisis simultaneously. And you can see its result in a single number that ought to be discussed constantly and somehow rarely is. In the United States, the richest 1% of households now hold around 30% of all the nation's wealth, a level of concentration that the historical record associates, again and again, with the unstable, top-heavy phase that precedes a crisis. And we have, published and dated and sitting in the scientific record since 2010, a mathematical model that took all of these drivers and forecast that they would peak into instability in the years around now. And we have, most unsettling of all, the reaction already visibly underway, the beginning of the lion phase happening in real time around us. And I am going to describe it in a way that will frustrate anyone hoping I will tell them which side to be on, because the whole point of the machine is that it does not care which side you are on. Across the Western world, and well beyond it, over roughly the last decade, there has been a rising wave of politics that is unmistakably lion in its form, not in its policies, not in its party, not in its particular grievances, which vary from country to country, but in its form. It is a politics of conviction over cleverness, of strength over subtlety, of borders and belonging and identity over management and expertise, a politics that treats the sophisticated persuasion of the Fox establishment not as wisdom to be respected, but as weakness and deceit to be swept away, that hungers openly for force and will, and a strong hand after decades of being told that all problems are complicated, and all solutions are technical, and all strong feelings are dangerous. I am not telling you whether any of this is good or bad, and I am not naming names, because the moment you attach the pattern to a particular leader or a particular flag, you have missed it. You have turned a description of the machine into a cheer for your team. which is exactly the fox move of mistaking the derivation for the engine. The point is the shape. The point is that the hunger for the lion, the swing away from cunning and back toward conviction and force, is precisely what Pareto's clock predicts you will see when a fox elite has ruled too long and grown too soft and hollowed out its own legitimacy, and it is precisely what you are seeing. And it is happening on schedule, and the people it is happening to, the sophisticated managerial persuasion class, mostly cannot see it as anything but a baffling outbreak of irrationality, because a fox has no framework for the return of the lion except to call it madness. It is not madness. It is the other half of the machine, waking up. Every escape route we have checked is closed. Rome did not escape the machine, it just took 80 years to run. France did not escape it. The Soviet Union did not escape it. Democracy does not escape it, because the iron law of oligarchy runs inside the democracy just as surely as inside anything else, generating a governing elite that votes cannot truly dislodge, only reshuffle. Prosperity does not escape it, because prosperity is what breeds the foxes and dissolves the cohesion in the first place, exactly as Ibn Khaldun watched it dissolve the Asabiyyah of dynasty after dynasty 600 years ago. Even seeing the machine does not let you escape it, because Michel saw it and was carried off by it anyway, and Burnham saw it and was helpless before it. And Mosca and Pareto saw it and spent their energy sniping at each other like the competing elites their own theory described. There is no exit that anyone has found. And that is the central question I told you at the beginning would stay open, and it has stayed open, and it is not going to close. Because as far as the entire tradition can tell, there is no answer to it. Is there a way out of the cycle? Nobody has ever found one. The best that anyone claims, and I want to be fair and give you the one thread of something other than doom, is Turchin's own observation that a handful of societies have managed to diffuse the pressure before it exploded, not by escaping the machine, but by deliberately reversing the wealth pump, opening the elite, and relieving the immiseration through reform from above before the lions arrived. He points to a few historical moments where a ruling class, staring at the same rising stress index, chose to reform itself and let the pressure out gradually rather than have it released catastrophically. Britain in the early 19th century is his favourite example, a society that in the 1810s and 1820s looked to be sliding toward the same kind of upheaval that had torn France apart, with immiseration and unrest and a frightened elite, and that instead, over the following decades, through a long series of reforms, the widening of the vote, the repeal of the laws that kept food expensive, the slow admission of new people and new interests into the governing class, let the pressure out gradually and avoided the explosion. He points to the United States during the Progressive Era and the New Deal, a period when an American elite, staring at the ferment of the early 20th century, chose to tax itself, to regulate itself, to raise the wages and improve the conditions of ordinary people, effectively to switch off the wealth pump for a generation, and bought decades of relative stability by doing so. And he makes a point about those cases that is easy to miss and worth holding on to. In each of them, he says, the crisis was diffused not by a revolution from below, but by the ruling class doing it to itself. No mob forced the reforms. The elite, or enough of it, understood what was coming and acted against its own short-term greed to prevent it. It has happened. It is possible. But notice what it requires. It requires the fox elite to voluntarily act against its own immediate interest, to open its ranks and surrender some of its wealth and share of power, out of a clear-eyed understanding of what happens if it does not. It requires the foxes to do the one thing foxes, in their late, clever, comfortable phase, are least psychologically equipped to do, which is to take the threat of force seriously enough to act before the force arrives. And that brings me, finally, to the thing I have been walking you towards since the first minute. The deepest and worst implication of the whole machine, the one that is not about Rome or France or Russia, or even about the abstract West, but about you, specifically, right now, in the act of listening to this. Here is what I could not stop thinking about, the thing that kept me up. The fox is defined by a specific trait, not by being evil, not by being on any particular political side, but by a specific mode of being in the world. The fox understands things. The fox analyzes. The fox sees the pattern, weighs the options, appreciates the complexity, holds the nuance, and prefers always to think and to persuade rather than to act and to fight. That is the fox. And that means that the very capacity to sit through 2.5 hours of careful analysis about the circulation of elites, to appreciate the historical parallels, to hold the caveats and the complications in mind, to find this whole thing fascinating rather than to feel the immediate animal need to do something about it, that capacity is the fox trait. The kind of person who watches this video, who seeks out the deep, unsettling, sophisticated version of reality, who wants to understand the machine, is, almost by definition, a fox. You are a fox. I am a fox. And the machine we have spent all this time understanding is a machine that, in its current phase, is selecting against exactly us. Let that sit for a moment, because I only get to say that phrase once, and this is where I am spending it. The lion does not analyze. The lion does not watch 2.5-hour videos weighing the nuances of elite circulation theory. The lion does not need to understand the machine, because the lion is the part of the machine that does not think, the part that acts, that coheres, that believes, that fights. When the transition comes, when the fox elite has hollowed itself out, and the accumulated force at the bottom finally reaches the top with a single well-aimed blow, the thing that gets destroyed is not evil people, and it is not stupid people. It is the clever, the analytical, the sophisticated, the people who understood everything and could act on none of it. The people who saw the clock most clearly are standing closest to it when it strikes. That is why the tradition keeps producing men like Michels and Burnham, men of extraordinary insight who were carried off or rendered helpless by the very current they had mapped. Their insight was the mark of the animal being selected against, and it is why the reading of the clock does not help you, which is the cruelest feature of the entire machine, and the one I find I cannot get out from under. Understanding is a fox activity. The clock is running out on the foxes, so the better you understand what is coming, the more precisely you have identified yourself as the thing it is coming for, and there is no move you can make from inside that understanding that gets you out, which is the part I keep turning over and cannot resolve. Suppose you accept all of this. Suppose the machine convinces you, and you decide, rationally, coldly, that the smart thing to do is to stop being a fox, to abandon analysis and cultivate conviction, to trade cunning for cohesion, to become a lion before the lions come. You cannot. The very fact that you arrived at that decision by reasoning your way to it, by weighing it as a strategy, by treating conviction as a thing to be adopted for its survival value, is the fox move. Real conviction. The lion kind. The kind that actually holds a group together and makes people willing to fight. Is not something you can choose the way you choose a coat because you calculated it would keep you warm. It is not available to the calculating mind, because the calculating mind is exactly the thing it is not. The lion does not believe because belief is advantageous. The lion simply believes without the layer of self-aware distance that would let you install belief in yourself on purpose. So the fox who understands the machine perfectly, who sees with total clarity that conviction is what survives and analysis is what dies, is left holding that clarity like a man reading the tide tables while standing in the water, able to say precisely how high it will rise and exactly when, and unable to do